Welcome to The Real Life Buyer. In this podcast, you will discover interviews with procurement and technical experts, business owners, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders. These experts will help you to develop and grow, accelerate your career, improve your business, save money, and buy smart. Now introducing The Real Life Buyer, Dave Barr.
Hello, and welcome to The Real Life Buyer. On today's podcast, I have the privilege to introduce Daniel Tolson. Daniel is regarded as Asia's #1 business coach, specializing in emotional intelligence. His inspiring journey began as a child, from having a linear sequential learning disability to becoming a consultant and subsequently a self-made multimillionaire. Daniel has helped over 15,000 business people in 60 countries to date, and his goal is to teach 1 million businesses to catapult their influence, accelerate impact, and unleash new income levels. Daniel speaks about personal success, motivation, goal setting, mental and emotional blockages, such as limiting beliefs, and many other subjects. Today, I wish to discuss emotional intelligence with Daniel and understand how this measurable ability may be developed and used in the world of purchasing and supply chain. So without any further delay, I welcome Daniel onto the podcast. Hi, Daniel.
Good evening. What a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much.
I did my best, put it that way. So let's help the listeners understand a little bit about you. You're obviously very prolific on social media, but would you mind helping the listeners appreciate your background, gain an understanding of what a linear sequential learning disability is and how it impacted and perhaps still impacts your life today?
Well, I remember being at school, coming home with these report cards that always had D's, E's and F's in them, and followed by messages to my parents. If Daniel just tried a little bit harder, he'd be a good student. If he just paid a little bit more attention, he'd be a good student. And so I'd get these report cards with this feedback, and it was a constant reminder that something was really holding me back. So I went through the grades, and as the years went on, the feedback remained the same until one teacher really pointed out that maybe there's something actually holding me back. So I think I was probably around about year 3 at that stage, and coming into year 4. And then they started to take me to some different specialists. So they quickly realised that my hips were out of alignment, my spine was twisted, the cranial plates in the skull were pushing down the left and right hemisphere of the brain. That was creating a visual impairment. It was causing me to be tone deaf. I was getting non-stop bleeding noses, collapsed bronchioles, and then I'd run, my knees would collapse. And so they thought maybe there's a couple of things wrong here. And so what would happen for me would be the teacher would write information on the board, and I could see what was on the board, but then as I wrote it down into the book, nothing matched. And then when I read it out, my eyes are working in 2 different directions. I'd read something that came off the left of the page and the right of the page. Now, there was nothing wrong with the words. They just weren't in the right order and sequence. So how I'm bringing in information, it's getting jumbled up. I'm putting it down on the paper, reading it back out, and it's just gibberish. So it wasn't that I couldn't read the words. Nothing was just in alignment. So they took me into remedial therapy, and there I stayed for about 5 years. Cranial realignment to get the platelets aligned, putting the back into place, fixing the knees and the hips. And it's taken me actually 41 years, just this year, finally to get my hips right. And so it really held me back. I loved to learn, which was a really interesting experience because I loved to learn. I loved knowledge, but I was always reinforced that I had a learning disability. But something inside of me told me that maybe I'm not the one with the disability. Maybe it's a teaching disability. And so for a good 25 years, I tried to figure it out. And finally, in my 30s, I figured it out.
As I mentioned in my introduction, Daniel, you are a recognized expert in emotional intelligence. Can you explain what this is to the layperson and its relevance in both the personal and the business context?
Well, my first job was a door-to-door salesman, and I sold newspapers, and I'd go door-to-door and I'd have to make sales. My second job was in a cafe, and then I worked with my family's pawnbroking business. And before anybody was talking about emotional intelligence as a buzzword, we used to just call this being street smart. So emotional intelligence is being street smart. You've got to know your strengths. You've got to know your weaknesses. You've got to know how to manage your emotions. And when I was a paper boy, I just thought people were going to buy newspapers off me, and I couldn't believe it what people said to me when I went door to door. They'd say, "We don't read." And I'd think to myself, how do you get information? I'd go to the next store and they'd say, "Well, I'm not the boss. I can't make the decision." I'm thinking, it's $1. And then other people would say, "I can't afford it." So I used to hear all of these objections for a $1 newspaper. And my uncle, he said to me, "Daniel, you just got to keep going from door to door without losing enthusiasm." So I had to learn to control my emotions at a young age. And then as I went about my newspaper run, I also had to build relationships, and which is a very key, important part of emotional intelligence. And you got to read other people's emotional makeup. I'd go to businesses and they were too busy to be bothered with the paperboy, but I couldn't take it personally. But I could read the plaque and say, "Oh, they're busy. They've got a lineup of customers. I can always come back later on, or I can come back tomorrow." So for me, emotional intelligence is being street smart. And I think even if we get back to the roots of it, and if we all thought about it as being street smart, then we could move past that buzzword and use it for how it was always intended to be used.
Okay, thanks for that. I think it helps people to understand where they're coming from. So having undertaken a little bit of research certainly on your website and various other things, I see you advise there are 5 key pillars in emotional intelligence, and those being self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, social awareness, and social regulation. So can you talk about these with respect to how they may apply perhaps to a purchasing professional? And can you share any examples demonstrating these pillars in practice?
One of the biggest takeaways from Harvard University recently is that emotional intelligence is the biggest predictor of success, and it accounts for about 58% of your day-to-day performance in your personal and in your professional life. So as we have a look at these 5 pillars, we can break them down, and it's like a waterfall. It cascades from self-awareness down to self-regulation, down to motivation, then through to social awareness, and then into social regulation. So self-awareness, we say, if you can't name it, you can't tame it. So we have strengths that we're aware of. If we're aware of a strength, we can utilize it. It might be your ability to negotiate as a purchasing manager. And if you have developed that skill and you're aware of that skill, you will use it more often. However, if it's in your blind spot and you don't know you have that tool in your tool bag, you will never use it. So if you can't name it, you can't tame it. It's like everybody's had the experience of losing their wallet. If you don't know where it is, you can't use your money. And we have more than 25 universally recognized skills that are attributed to day-to-day success, and negotiation is one of them. So, for example, you might say to yourself, my strength as a purchasing manager is the ability to negotiate favorable terms. Now, if you can articulate that to a prospective employer, then you're going to get to the front of the line really fast. But if you don't know you have that, people think they've got it. They think they've got it. They have seen glimpses of it, but they might have never fully utilized it. I know personally, when I grew up in our family pawnbroking business, we didn't negotiate. And my mum had a sign, no haggle, no hassle. We will offer you our best price, and it's our walkaway price immediately. However, that suited us, but it didn't suit the market. And I'd be scared to think of how much business we lost because we didn't negotiate. Be scared to think of how much more money we could have made if we just didn't give that first price and people jumped up and said, yes, absolutely, I'll take it. So it starts with self-awareness, and self-awareness is about recognizing our limitations. Now, what we're made of, our DNA, some of our DNA is turned on and some of it is turned off. And one of the key components of emotional intelligence is interpersonal skills. It's the ability to get along with other people. And so we have to make sure that these skills are turned on. And if they're not, we've got to seek to learn more and upskill so we can utilize that, especially in purchasing. The second pillar of emotional intelligence is self-regulation. And what happens here is we have to learn to manage our emotions. And for a lot of people who are in their career, especially purchasing managers, there's a lot of disappointment that goes along in purchasing. There's the deal that you almost got over the line. There's the one that got over the line and then it fell through. And then there's those ones that you thought were going to turn out to be really good, but then nothing ever came from it. And so we've got to learn to manage our emotions. And one of the big ones purchasing managers have to learn to manage is the fear of being taken advantage of. And this happens in negotiation because people ask you, what are your needs? They start to ask those solutions-based questions. What's the problem? What do you need? And you don't want to reveal too much because of a fear of being taken advantage of. If I tell them too much, they might understand what my budget is and they might charge me more. So we've got to learn to manage these fears. Especially with purchasing managers, well, we have to learn to manage our fear of rejection. Now, if we have a fear of rejection and we haven't learned how to tame it, we won't ask for concessions in a negotiation because we're afraid to hear the word no. So that's self-regulation. The third one is motivation. And motivation, I'd like you to think of this more as resiliency. And I know a lot of purchasing managers specialize in this career, and they have careers that might span 10, 20, or even 30 years. And you've got to be as motivated today as you were when you started. What prevents us from being motivated all the time and we end up demotivated? Well, it can be a series of back-to-back losses. We try to get deals across the line, they don't come through, we get disappointed. And we've got to be able to get back up. So in Japan, we say fall down 7 times, get back up 8. So it's that resiliency to be able to do this job over and over again and to produce predictable results. The fourth pillar of emotional intelligence is social awareness. Now, most people probably know this as empathy. Now, without empathy, you cannot negotiate. If you don't have empathy for the other side, if you can't read the other side's mental and emotional makeup, you can't get the right concessions. And I learned this in the pawnbroking business. You could smell out the desperate buyer. You could see it. You could read it on them. And then you could just give them your bottom line offer straight away and get the deal done. But if you didn't have that, you'd misread people. The fifth pillar of emotional intelligence is social regulation. And this is your ability to influence and persuade. So you might be able to read the emotional makeup, but if you can't influence and persuade somebody to your favourable terms and conditions, ultimately the deal will never take place. And if it does, it might be a win-lose negotiation and you'll never get to enter into a negotiation ever again. So they're the 5 key pillars, and that would be the practical areas of emotional intelligence and some examples of how it would look in a purchasing manager's role.
Perfect. That's really good. That's really good. Thanks for that. I want to come back to some of those points in just a minute. But first, again, in my search, you really switched me on to discovering more about this area. And so I've gleaned some more information from other books. And one of the skills acronyms I came across was something called RULER. And that was recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate. What are your thoughts on this method? Is that one of the common ones? Do you aspire to any other methods or suggest other things?
That's a new one to me. I like it. RULER. I like that one. We used to have one in aviation called ALERT.
Okay.
We'd say to ourselves, ALERT,
that sounds
when
scary.
we're coming into landing. You'd ask yourself, what's the aircraft type? Where's the location of your jump seat? What's your equipment? What's the risks? What's the threats? So for me, I always start with self-awareness. And if you can't name it, you can't tame it. So about 95% of the adult population claim to be emotionally intelligent, yet only about 15% of them are. So the first part is really, you've got to have an accurate self-assessment. And that is very hard for people. It's hard because humans have an aspiration factor. I'm 5'11", but I tell everybody I'm 6 foot. I want that extra inch. I'm 101 kilo. I'm a former athlete, but I don't want to be seen as triple digits. So I tell them I'm 99 and a half. And I've got a 9.5-year-old daughter and a 4.5-year-old son. And when I measure their height against the back of the door frame, they always stand up on their tippy toes. And I can't get an accurate measurement. So I push their head down and say, come on, get back down to earth. So in reference to RULER, what I always say is you've got to have an accurate self-assessment. And it's hard because humans have aspiration factors. I want to be better looking than I really am. So I'm going to shave in a unique way that gives me a better jawline. If I go a little bit grey, I might colour my hair. One of the ladies might put on some makeup so you appear better on the outside. This is normal and natural. However, we have to have an accurate self-perception or we do make some major errors. Now, coming from aviation, I learned about this. I was involved in critical incident stress management, and there was an accident that took place in Melbourne. Now, when the pilot was keying in the takeoff weight of the aircraft, he put in 234 tonnes. It should have been 324 tonne for the takeoff weight. So as he's accelerating down the runway, he gets to the end of the runway, he's running out of runway and he's got no more thrust. And he quickly realises that he's calculated about 100 tonnes less weight in the aircraft. So he had to put full thrust on. He had to pull the nose up in the air. The tail started to drag along the runway. Sparks are flying out. The underbelly of the aircraft's caught on fire. It eventually goes off over the grass. It starts to hit the landing lights and it rips open the belly of the aircraft. And then it climbs just over the top of the buildings and just misses a couple of buildings by a couple of metres. Now, when you have 150,000 tonne of fuel on an aircraft, you can't land that aircraft back on the runway, because if you do, it's just going to split in half. So he had to fly up in the air around Melbourne, dump all the fuel, and once the aircraft was light enough, still on fire, then he's got to land it. And that's just an example of an inaccurate self-perception. It's an inaccurate takeoff weight, and eventually it leads to a disaster. So we have to have a very strong and accurate self-assessment to succeed in our careers.
Oh, blimey, that's a scary story. I'm glad I'm not a pilot. My goodness. Okay, let's look at relationships a little bit. Obviously, a person is meeting people regularly all the time. Perhaps not so much recently, or certainly virtually, should we say, but less in person. But we're getting back to a normal now. And obviously, sometimes you identify a great supplier or contractor to work with, but sometimes you struggle to connect with their representative. So how can one's emotional intelligence skills be used to make the best of the relationship and influence the relationship in a positive way to achieve one's business goals?
I love that question. I love it. What we've been taught in the past is to follow the golden rule, which is treat others the way that you want to be treated. Now, this might shock you. I'm aggressive. I'm competitive. I want to win. Not everybody wants to be treated aggressively. Not everybody is competitive. Not everybody always wants to take the win. Now, if I was to treat everybody like that, I'd alienate people really quickly. So that old golden rule, treat others the way that you want to be treated, it doesn't work in today's world. If somebody treated me aggressively and with competition, I'd actually like that. However, most people aren't like that. So we're going to move away from the golden rule and we're going to move to what's called the platinum rule. And a friend of mine, Dr. Tony Alessandro, come up with the platinum rule. And it says, treat others the way that they want to be treated. So my personality style is I'm very optimistic. I'm a high trust type of person. However, a lot of purchasing officers aren't optimistic and they aren't all that trusting of other people. It's not in their nature. They are more pessimistic and distrusting of others. And that's the perfect trait for a purchasing officer. So you've got to remember that's your strength. So if I was to deal with a purchasing officer and I came in like a cheerleader, super optimistic, super trusting, giving them all of my trust immediately, they'd look at me and go, this guy's a little bit over the top. What's the go here? What's the catch here? Do I smell a little bit of bullshit here? And if I treated them how I want to be treated, I would lose them immediately. There would be no rapport and I would kill the relationship straight away. So with the platinum rule, what we say is treat others the way that they want to be treated. And if I was meeting somebody who was pessimistic, now that pessimistic is not a negative thing, by the way. So if people hear that and they go, oh wow, that's pessimistic. No, pessimistic is just a way that they deliver trust to others. My mother-in-law, she's an accountant. She doesn't trust people. She trusts the numbers.
Yeah,
and that's why she's had a successful career for 50 years, because she trusts the numbers. And even the business owner who says, trust me, she says, hey, there's $100,000 missing here. Oh, just trust me. So what I would do is I would adapt, adjust, and respond for the purpose of gaining rapport. Now, rapport has got a dirty word over the years. Rapport has closely become close to manipulation. No. See, what Milton H. Erickson said, who was the number one hypnotherapist in the world, he said that anything is possible in the presence of a good rapport. And if I'm putting time aside to build rapport with somebody, it actually means I want that relationship. I'm investing time into this because the only way you can have a relationship is with time invested. So I would learn about their behavioural style, and then I'd adapt, adjust, and respond my presentation, my communication to suit their style. Now, if I gain rapport with them, then I know anything's possible in the presence of a good rapport. If my quote is 20% out of alignment, they'll very politely tell me that you're a little bit high. You might have to sharpen that pencil just a little bit. And then I could go away and do that. So I believe rapport is essential. And then the platinum rule is the rule that governs them all.
Great. Now, we touched on a few things there. Obviously, negotiating, as you're quite right, is one of the things I have to do regularly. But as I deal in an international market, obviously, I'm dealing with different negotiating styles from different countries. The guys who negotiate in China are very different to those in Russia and those in the UK, perhaps in Australia. So one has to be able to adjust fairly quickly to understand what type of style is this. So I'm trying to learn more about emotional intelligence. I want to read the situation and read the person. How can I hone my skills from emotional intelligence when I meet somebody, perhaps only one or two times, and subsequent negotiations aren't always face-to-face? So how can I optimize my skill set in this area?
One of the beautiful parts about emotional intelligence is that when we start to observe people's behaviours are a silent language, but behaviours are the same across cultures. So let me give you a formula. When we're looking at people, we want to have a look at how they approach problems and challenges. Secondly, we want to have a look at how they influence people and contacts. Thirdly, we want to have a look at how they steady the pace of the environment. And then fourthly, we want to have a look at how they approach policy and constraints. Now, these behaviours will be the same in China as they are in Russia because we're talking about behaviours. Our spoken language may be different, but our behaviours will be the same. So some people, when they come to approach problems and challenges, can approach it very aggressively. And you'll be able to sense the emotion of anger. And so what you do is if they like to approach things aggressively, you adapt, adjust, and respond to that. So it's about flexibility in behaviour. Secondly, we have a look at how they influence people and contacts. Now, as I mentioned before, some people are really optimistic. If you're more pessimistic, what you might have to do is you might have to crank up the optimistic dial a little bit and deal with them and build that relationship. Those people will tend to talk about you, your team, other people, and they'll be really interested in you as a person. And that can be really uncomfortable if you're a purchasing officer who says, I don't want to get to know you personally. But if you want the relationship, then we just adapt, adjust, and respond to that style. The third part here is we have pace and consistency. There's some people who want fast relationships, like McDonald's relationships. You drive in, you place your order, you drive away, you're never seeing them again. And if that's what people want, then give it to them. They say a man convinced against his own will be of the same opinion still. Don't try to change their behaviours. Adapt your behaviour to suit the situation. But then you'll have other people who are more relationship focused. They show less emotion on their face. They're more poker face. They really care about you. However, they don't like to get too personal too fast. So when you're approaching them, you've just got to slow down and adapt to that style. And then finally, you have how people approach policy and constraints. Now, there's some people out there who are rule breakers. When they come to a negotiation, they don't bend the rules, they break the rules. And the way that they negotiate is very intuitively. However, we get the other people who are very compliant. They follow the systems, they follow protocol, they make sure all the I's are dotted, they make sure all the T's are crossed, and their greatest fear is making an error. And so those people will tend to go a little bit slower. So what you've got to do is just got to adapt, adjust, and respond. And if you can match and mirror people's behaviours, then you'll build rapport. And what we've got to remember about rapport is building rapport with the person's unconscious mind. It's a response to the autonomic nervous system. It's not the words you use. Hey, do you love soccer? I hate soccer. Bang, no rapport. How do you feel about the war over there? Love it. Oh my gosh, you're opposed to it. Oh my gosh. And then you start to get in conflict. And so what we've got to do is we've just got to adapt, adjust, and respond to behaviours and build rapport. And rapport is about responsiveness, not necessarily liking somebody. It takes a long time to like somebody, but you can learn to respond to them very quickly.
Excellent. I love the answer to that. Superb. Thank you very much for sharing there. Now, there's also another situation when you may be the small fry in this discussion. You may be facing somebody who works for a massive company with lots of leverage and their presence is big. They've got the gravitas, shall we say. And so in those cases, the person may struggle with their own abilities, their own limiting beliefs that hits their self-confidence in that situation. So how do you see professionals can work to overcome those issues and remain positive and confident in such situations?
I think this is a universal problem. It's a problem around the world, and it has its roots in what we call our self-image. Now, there's three things that we're going to improve our confidence. First of all, we're going to improve our self-image. It's how we see ourselves. And sometimes it's like this David versus Goliath story. Just because that person's 10 foot tall and you're 5 foot, it doesn't actually make them any stronger. We've seen this in the movie Troy. We've seen that before. And so what you've got to do is you have to have a positive self-image. You have to see yourself as somebody who's adding value, who's making a contribution. You also have to remember with part of your self-image that they might be able to get this product or service anywhere else in the world, but they can only get you right here. And from all the things that I've learned in sales is it's not the price that's the most important thing. It's the relationship. People want a relationship first and a sale second. Now, maybe you're going to do a one-time negotiation. They don't care about the relationship. However, without a relationship, a purchase is very risky. So you've got to learn to become a relationship expert. You've got to learn to see yourself as somebody of value. Now, when it comes to the self-ideal, this is the person that you'd ideally like to become. Now, some people say, fake it until you make it. However, the presupposition of the word fake makes people feel like an imposter. So what I like to say instead is act as if now. So what you do is you say, who do I need to be to bring this deal together? And you have a look at the person that you need to be. And then what you do, you start to act as if you are already that person. And the action actually creates the fact. The more you think, feel, and act like that person, the faster you'll become that person. However, you'll have congruency. And you'll say, I don't feel like a fraud. I don't feel like an imposter. I feel worthy of this. I'm a good person. I'm bringing great value. And I have their best interests in mind. So when I started out in my career, I knew what I wanted to become. But there was a significant gap between where I am today and where I want to be in 10 or 20 years now. But there's nothing that's preventing me or stopping me from acting as if I'm already that person. It's like Muhammad Ali. What did he say? I am the greatest. Now, he used to say that. Nobody believed him, but he believed it. And then eventually, what did everybody say? He is the greatest. He had to convince himself first. And then the world caught up with him. And now what do they say? He was the greatest. And we have to follow that. You know, if we do what successful people do, then we will get the same results. Now, the third part to the equation is also our self-worth and self-esteem. A lot of people don't feel worthy of success. They don't feel worthy of putting the deal together. Now, if you don't feel worthy of that, the emotion will be picked up by the other party. And we say that emotions are more contagious than COVID. And you ask women, it's like my wife. She says, Daniel, you were just so confident. There was guys a lot better looking than you, far more successful, richer. However, you had the confidence. And people really like confidence. And confidence is an emotion, and emotions are contagious.
I really like that. Excellent. So I love the last bit. That's really exposing yourself there, how your wife described you. Fantastic. Okay. One of the, I think the measure for emotional intelligence is called emotional quotient. Just want to understand that a little bit more. And how can you increase, well, perhaps how you measure yourself now, and how can you increase that score to obviously to be where you want it to be?
With our IQ, our IQ is about our aptitude and our intelligence, and most people have their IQ tested somewhere between, we'll call it 10 and 15 years of age. And that measurement of IQ at that stage of your life will remain consistent. Doesn't go up, it doesn't go down, and you're kind of stuck with what you've got. However, emotional intelligence is fluid. It increases and it also decreases. So one company I was working with, they were having a problem with one of their C-suite, and he was a turnaround expert. So they would buy businesses in distress, and then they would send in the turnaround expert. Now, he could turn around the business. He could fire 200, 300, 400 people, and his heart rate wouldn't go up. His pulse rate wouldn't change. He'd go to sleep at night. However, 2.5 years later, their business, as it went into that growth curve, they couldn't get the growth because the team was stuck in that storming phase, and he couldn't build enough respect and rapport with the team. Now, the reason why he was successful in the turnaround, because his empathy, his social awareness was less active. So he could fire people, make those tough people decisions, and he wouldn't blink. He wouldn't be short of breath. He'd have no anxiety because he didn't know how other people felt. So in that instance, albeit his emotional intelligence was less active in that area, he was a superior performer. Now, other people who had been in that role before had a really high or active level of emotional intelligence, and it was so high that they become empathetic, and they'd say, how can I fire this person? I know what it's like to have a family. I know what it's like to go without money. And they don't fire people, and all of a sudden the business collapses, and then everybody loses the job. So with emotional intelligence, we have less active and more active emotional intelligence, and it's very context specific. So if the emotional intelligence is too high, it can limit you. If it's too low, or if it's less active, it can actually benefit you. So the question is, how do we improve it? Well, first of all, we take an emotional quotient assessment. And if any of you have been working from home during COVID-19 and you've hopped on the scales and you've looked at that number and it's scared you and you want to avoid the scale, well, the first thing we do with emotional intelligence is we stand on the scale and we measure ourselves in these 5 key areas. And then as we have a look at these 5 key areas, we'll start to see where our strengths and our limitations are. And then we start to improve these at, just incremental increases at a time. We say inch by inch, it's a cinch, by the yard, it's hard. So for example, if your self-awareness was really low, then you'd have to start to get more clarity on your strengths and your limitations. So I worked with a real estate agent. He was less active in self-awareness. He would go into a presentation. He had no idea at the pace that he spoke at. He had no idea about his tone. He had no idea about the emotional vibe that he was putting out. And he didn't realize he was losing the customer in the first 10 to 15 minutes of the presentation. And then they were just too polite to kick him out. So he was losing 6 out of 7 deals. Once he became more aware of his self-awareness, once he started to regulate his emotions more effectively, then his results went up. Within 18 months, his emotional intelligence went up 40% in the area of self-awareness, and then his income rose by 250% inside of 18 months. So there's a direct connection, and the global statistic is for every 1% improvement or every 1 point improvement in your emotional quotient, you'll see £1,350 improvement in your annual salary. So there is a direct connection. 1 point equals £1,350 improvement in your salary. Now, for accounting firms who have teams of people with higher levels of emotional intelligence, these teams can write 250% more revenue every single year than teams with lower emotional quotients.
Wow, it's amazing to hear those numbers that they've been able to be that specific. That's really quite amazing. Okay.
The beautiful part is one of the scientific assessments that I use. We have more than 35 million case studies over the past 30 years. So once you start to track people, and I track teams, I measure them at the start of their training and I measure them at the end of it. Some of their emotional intelligence goes up, some of it goes down. And the bosses have called me and said, Daniel, you've trained these people and their emotional intelligence has gone down. I said, yeah, that's correct. Because the first assessment they took, they had over-evaluated themselves. The second one they took is the accurate self-assessment. And once you have an accurate self-assessment, you become a higher performer because you're well aware of your strengths and your weaknesses.
Oh, that's Very interesting that. Okay. You mentioned a bit earlier, and I said I'd come back to it, is the silent fears. You mentioned things like being taken advantage of, I think you said, fear of rejection, fear of losing the deal, fear of failing, fear of ridicule even. Maybe that everybody's got this massive expectation that, oh, this person's going in, they're going to get this deal, done. It's a done job. So for those people under that kind of pressure, or those kind of fears that are manifesting in them, what kind of exercises, what sort of things can they do to mitigate those things?
The first thing you've got to get your head around is which fear is impacting you and how it shows up. So, for example, if you're leading a team and you have a fear of losing control, then you won't delegate. And you'll probably be very reluctant to employ. And then what you'll do is you'll work all long hours and you'll try to do everything yourself. So you've got to identify how it manifests. For people who are experiencing a fear of rejection, well, what might be happening for them is they might be afraid to speak their truth. They'll be sitting around the boardroom table, everybody else will have their say, yet they'll be biting their tongue. And so when it comes to a fear of rejection, about 99% of the adult population have a fear of public speaking. Now, it's not the skill of speaking in public that's the problem. It's the fear of rejection that's the problem. And when we look at the science, the average person has heard the word no 148,000 times before they were 18. So when it comes to this fear of rejection, it's an indirect fear. They're actually afraid of hearing the word no, which subsequently triggers the fear of rejection. Thirdly, it's the fear of losing stability. Here in Taiwan, we say we're afraid of losing our rice bowl. We're afraid that somebody's going to take our rice bowl away from us. And people will fly under the radar for years. They will be low key because they're afraid that if they put their neck out for the company, for themselves, then they might get their heads chopped off. So they stay in the comfort zone. And instead of being a high performer, they just go along and they just be average. Because when you're average, you don't get a lot of attention. You don't get negative attention and you don't get positive attention. You're just kind of there in the middle and there's no conflict there. However, everything that we want is outside of our comfort zone. Higher income is outside of the comfort zone. Promotion outside of the comfort zone. That new house, that new car, outside of the comfort zone. But people are more afraid to leave the comfort zone than they actually are to pursue their goals. So these are the things that we've got to be aware of. Now, we talk about upgrading our operating system. So the first thing that we have to be aware is we have to be aware of our triggers. What triggers off this fear? We've also got to get an accurate perception of our personality type because our personality type responds differently. See, if I experience anger, I like anger because I'm a competitive person. You bring anger here, it puts fuel in my tank. But if I'm somebody who likes to avoid anger and yields to controversy, then that might not work in my favour. Same situation, same trigger, but the emotional response based on our personality will change our reaction. We also have to take a look at what environment does it impact us in? And I think your example was perfect. Some people will walk into a business of equivalent size and they'll do a great negotiation. But all of a sudden they walk into a multinational that's doing 10 or 11 figures a year and they'll freak out and go, ah! Just because of the perception of size. So we've got to have a look at the environment. After the trigger, we always have an emotional response. So we also have to accept the fact that we are 100% emotional. And after the emotion comes the cognition, which is the thought process. However, this is really confusing because if the fear kicks in, I have an emotional hijack and I'll end up acting before I think. So this is about upgrading our operating system. What's the trigger? What's our personality type? What's the environment? What's the emotion that's getting triggered? And then can we still think rationally before we act? And that's the order and sequence that we've got to attend to this.
Interesting you mentioned about the public speaking. My mind just goes back, it wasn't that long ago, there was the tennis player, Naomi Osaka, who suffered, should we say, a rather negative comment from the crowd. I don't know if you heard about that, but she was clearly visibly and emotionally impacted by that comment. And it obviously took her off her game completely. And that's the fear, isn't it? People are up on the stage or they're in a situation where they're being observed and they take a significant knock from somebody. How can you cope with that? Those things that impact you suddenly when you're not expecting it. How on earth do you deal with that?
We call this a Uden moment. These things come unexpected. You're out there, you're playing the game, you're doing what you love, and all of a sudden, hey, the voice comes from the crowd, and it's unexpected. Oftentimes for the individual, it's also very dramatic, and you think to yourself, out of all that, all the good things I've done, and somebody says that, this is insane. And then you can become isolated. So there you are on the court, and there's 5,000 people watching. Are they all against me? And what happens next is the coping mechanism. Now, if you've never prepared for it, you won't have a coping mechanism. And so we call this a Uden moment. And then people get stuck. Now, the reason why they get stuck is because one negative emotion will impact your performance for 4 hours. Now, a tennis match very rarely goes beyond 4 hours.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you get one negative emotion triggered. Now that's impacting your performance. It's impacting the way you think. It's impacting the way that you act. And essentially, you lose focus, you lose your mindset. What we know about the mind is that we have a stream of consciousness, and we have about 70,000 thoughts per day. And your thoughts predict 95% of your feelings, and then your feelings determine your action. So a lot of people are trying to manage this emotion. But if I don't have a coping mechanism, nothing's going to change. If nothing changes, nothing changes. So the fastest way to do it without going to your local counsellor, without calling your local coach, without going to the psychologist, you got to remember that you can substitute your thoughts. And you can substitute a negative thought for a positive thought. And that's where affirmations are really important. So when I was a Australian champion athlete, there was many times where I would go out and the conditions weren't perfect. The water was rough. The boat was going too fast. And I'd fall off. And I'd just say to myself, this too shall pass. This too shall pass. This too shall pass. And whilst you say an affirmation like that, this too shall pass, it jams your thought process. And you quickly move away from a negative thought to a positive thought. And then you're back in control. Then you don't have to worry about waiting 4 hours. See, it takes 5 positive emotions to cancel out one negative emotion. Imagine that. You're out on the tennis court. Oh my gosh, I've got a negative emotion. This is going to hang around for 4 hours. Now I've got to get 5 positive emotions. And you look over to your opposition. Are they going to lend me a positive emotion? No. Is there any positive emotions in the esky? Is the umpire going to give me a positive emotion? Are the other fans going to give me a positive emotion? No, nobody can give you a positive emotion. It's an internal job. So it's very hard. It's like eating a hamburger for lunch and then having to go to the gym for 5 hours. It's easier just not to eat the burger. So emotional management starts with controlling your thoughts. Have an affirmation. An affirmation keeps the conscious mind busy, and you say, this too shall pass. You'll get your clear emotional state back and you'll be back in control.
That's great advice. I love that. Love that. It's great to be able to deal with something in the here and now. So thanks for sharing that one. I'm very conscious of our time. It's been fantastic, but I know the clock is ticking. How can people hear more about yourself, your business, your content? Where should they look for you?
In 2010, I got a telephone call at 4 a.m. in the morning, and my manager said, Daniel, there's been an accident on the aircraft. And I said, okay, is this a peer support call? And he said, no, it's your fiance. I went, oh my gosh. In 2010, my wife was involved in an accident, and for the following 2.5 years, she was in and out of surgery just to literally get back up on her feet. 3 major knee reconstructions. And for both of us at that time, we come to a turning point in our life. We knew that life would never be the same again. And what we both had to deal with at that stage was learning to deal with our fears, our doubts, and our self-limiting belief. She lost her job, I walked away from mine, and we had to reinvent ourselves. And I'd learned that during that time that fully 85% of our success comes down to our mindset. And both of us had to get our mindsets back because of these traumatic events. So every Monday night here in Taiwan at 8 p.m, that's probably around about 8 a.m. in the morning, maybe a little bit later. Maybe, what's the time there now? 10 a.m?
No, it's currently nearly 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
2 o'clock. So normally about 1 or 2 p.m. UK time, I run a masterclass, and it's called Unleashed Masterclass. And I'm sharing with the attendees how to break through that negativity, how to break through that low self-confidence so we can start smashing our goals faster. So my website is unleashedmasterclass.com, and that's a free event every Monday.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. So one last little thought. Obviously, out of this has come an awful lot of information. And it's occurring to me that perhaps we don't take this subject matter seriously enough. I'm thinking about not only the workplace, but also schools. How do young people deal with these things? How do they learn emotional intelligence? How do they read these things? What are your thoughts about making this perhaps something that should be a standard training thing in schools, and it should become more commonplace in the workplace?
It's going to come down to our parents, meaning us. I was having a conversation with my daughter today. She's 9.5, and we're talking about the other children in her class. And they go to what's called an Anchi barn or a bushy barn here, and they learn language, maths, English. And at some of these schools today, if they make a mistake, they still give them the cane on the hand. And I asked my daughter, I said, how often do they get a whack on the hand? She said, probably every lesson. I said, does it make them better students? And she said, no, it doesn't. And she said, Dad, even if they make a mistake, the parents, they make them squat. So you got to do like a sumo squat. And she said that if the other students come home with bad grades, the parents make them squat for half an hour or an hour as a form of punishment. And I said to my daughter, I said, does it help them get better grades? And she said, no, they still have bad grades. So as parents, we have to be very consciously aware that if we punish our children for making a mistake, then what will happen is they'll learn that mistakes hurt, and everybody avoids pain. And so if we don't stop it in our generation, it will continue for at least another 2 or 3 generations. So it's really coming down to us as an individual. I think for us to change the school system, for a lot of us, we just don't have the time and the effort. We're all working at least 2,000 to 2,500 hours a year. Some of us purchasing officers are probably working 3,000 to 3,500 hours a year. You just don't have time to fight that battle. So change it at home. When your children make a mistake, make it a pleasurable learning experience. We say that there's no failure. There's only feedback. And when children get good feedback, then they can course correct. And if they have a win after that, they'll realize that, wow, feedback's a great thing. Mum and Dad gave me great feedback and I got a better mark. Now, I can brag about this because that's what I've consciously chosen. I went through learning disabilities. They impacted me, but I think my biggest impact was probably the psychological scarring that the teachers convinced me that I couldn't learn, that I wasn't a good boy, that I wasn't going to succeed in the future. That was all bullshit. It was bullshit because I had attitude, I had mindset, but it set me back till I was 32. I was still struggling at 32 with all that junk. So as parents, let's stop it. And let's get our house in order before we try to correct anybody else's.
Oh, that's lovely advice. Thank you very much for sharing your stories today and, these pearls of wisdom that have come out. And that's a lovely note to finish on. So I appreciate very much your time today, Daniel, and hopefully look forward to seeing you again. But I can certainly say I'm consuming your content and finding it fantastic. So thank you for sharing your wisdom.
Anytime. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Take care, Daniel.
Thank you.
So there's another Real Life Buyer podcast. I do hope you enjoyed it and it's given you some ideas and inspiration for greater action and achievement. If you are a purchasing or a supply chain professional, business owner or director, come and join my Facebook group, the Purchasing and Supply Chain Community Hub, a safe place to engage with like-minded, friendly people. See you soon. Bye.